This is the Polar Vantage V3. It's Polar's first watch to include offline mapping, their first watch to include ECG, and their first endurance sports watch to use an AMOLED display. In fact, there's a bunch of other firsts here as well that I've been testing over the last month or so, from swimming to running to cycling, even a 12-hour, nearly 60-kilometer hike with over 9,000 feet of elevation gain. The question is, does Polar stick the landing? This is arguably Polar's most important watch in at least a decade, if not ever. It's no secret the company's been having some troubles the last few years, both from a product standpoint, but also financially, and this watch is seen as the pivotal turning point in the company and their future going forward. So I'm going to walk through step by step all the new features on this watch and tell you how it really works, both the good and the bad, from mapping and navigation, to sports usage, to ECG, skin temperature, and of course the accuracy of the GPS and heart rate as well. So with that, let's begin with the easiest thing, which is the price. It's priced at $599 US, and there's effectively just one model of this. There's not different like bezel materials, different price points. You can see the watch here. It's a fairly lightweight watch overall. It feels nice on the wrist. I like the band material. All is good there. In the box, you've got a USB-C charging cable with their adapter, their port adapter right there. Just simply snaps on the back magnetically. It's the same basic port adapter they've used on a couple other watches recently, except now with the USB-C cable, which is nice. Battery life-wise, they claim up to 8 days in gesture-based mode and 5 days in always-on mode. I'm going to talk about all those GPS battery claims later in the video in that entire dedicated battery section. So first, let's start off with some basics, and then we'll kind of like go deeper and deeper and deeper until we get to like the accuracy rabbit hole, if you will. So this is the watch right here, and this is the watch face. You can customize the watch face a little bit if you want to. These different complication points right there, so the weather, my steps, day, and so on. As you can see, it is a touchscreen display. Of course, on the side, there's also 3 buttons here and 2 buttons there. I appreciate the buttons. The buttons are super easy to use in the rain with that texturing on there. They're really nicely done. I know there's been a trend to get rid of buttons in some sports watches, but I feel like buttons are making a comeback, even like with the Apple Watches and the Samsungs of the world. Now, going back here, this is the back button right there. I can swipe down from the top. This is sort of like a quick controls menu. The one notable new one here is the flashlight. So you see that right there. I can just tap that, and it makes the screen a bright white flashlight. Now, there is no flashlight like on the front, like some other watches have a LED flashlight there. It's just this bright screen. And while I appreciate this brightness, it is crazy bright, by the way. I know you can't see it in these bright studio lights, is being so bright, but the only downside is this like illuminates the crap out of any room you have. I wish they would add some other settings here for changing the dimness levels like most other watches have. Just so, again, I appreciate the blowtorch, but just tone it down a little bit. Anyways, backing up there, you can swipe off to the right here, and you see different basically dashboard widgets, if you will. So this is the steps one, activity tracking. I can tap into that and then scroll down through this list here, and you see my active times from today. My heart rate's not on right now, obviously, but well, my heart rate, you get the point. Maximum, the minimum, the energy used, and so on. I haven't done a workout yet today, otherwise this maximum will be a lot higher. And of course, all this stuff is synced to the Polar Flow app on your smartphone. You can see a couple screenshots right here of what this looks like for just a typical day's worth of activities. And then swipe through these other dashboard panels. For example, here's my sleep one. This is called Nightly Recharge, one of 2 different sleep kind of panels that you have. And last night it's telling me I had poor nightly recharge. I'd say it's probably accurate, only about 6 hours of sleep. You can see my average heart rate, and my BTB, my heart rate variability, my breathing rate, etc. Swiping to the right here, you see boost from sleep. So what this does is it looks at your sleep schedule. It builds it up over the course of at least a week. So you need 7 days of data really for this to kind of hit full effect there. And it's showing you on the screen when you're going to have the most energy during the day for that upcoming day. So based on last night's sleep, you can see it has the most energy between 9 and roughly 2-ish or so. And then I've got a lull mid-afternoon, coffee time clearly. And then again from 5 or so until 9 or 10 at night, based on my sleep patterns. Here's my sleep details from last night, for example, the time I went to sleep and woke up, and all this was correct. This is exactly what time I went to sleep and woke up. My sleep score. The sleep gate is when it thinks I'm going to fall asleep each night, and again, this is pretty accurate there as well. Now, when it comes to accuracy of what time I went to sleep and what time I woke up, that's been spot on. Even if I woke up briefly in the morning for like kid disturbances of some sort, things like that, no problems there. It detected me going back to sleep. That was all good. In terms of sleep phases and stages like deep sleep, REM, etc., that's not something I tend to focus on because the comparative technology to comparing that to isn't that accurate. Even like at the medical grade, it's really not that accurate in the grand scheme of things. So I just assume that all wearables kind of suck there, and mostly they do. So it sort of works out. Anyways, Going to the right there, this is new. This is the nightly skin temperature. This is something that Polar added with this watch. And what it does is it has a baseline first of 3 days. You got to wear it, 3 nights in particular, you have to wear it for. And then you'll start seeing this here. So if I tap into this, you can see the last 7 nights. And this is the difference to my baseline. So just a very slight difference there. The idea here being they could take this data and do other things with it. For example, some devices like the Whoop band that I have on there, or the Oura Ring that's charging over there right now, they can do women's ovulation cycle prediction based on some of this data. But Polar isn't doing that today. They're just simply showing you that data. So for most of us, it's not super useful. Also keep in mind, this data is very dependent on your environment. I've been in and out of hotels a lot all over the last 4 to 6 weeks. And so this is constantly shifting depending on whether there's AC on or heat on or whatever the case may be. Anyways, swiping through some of the widgets you have, for example, your sunset and sunrise one, you've got weather, and you can tap into these and get more details about them if you want to. All of this is pretty much the same as it's been in the past. So instead, let's look at another new feature, which is the ECG feature. But before we do that, a quick note, if you are finding this video interesting or useful, now's a great time to whack the like button on the bottom there. It really does help with this video and this channel quite a bit. So back out to the back here, back out to the beginning. On this screen, you will tap the bottom left once, and you'll swipe down into the tests. So inside the test there, you'll see this orthostatic test, SpO2, ECG. SpO2 is new. That's basically a way to look for your blood oxygenation levels or your SpO2 levels. And then down below that is ECG. The way this works is I would put this on my wrist right here. I'll go ahead and get it on there. Now, typically speaking, you want to have this on your wrist for a little bit of time so there's some moisture on the back of this. It'll read better. In my case, I can solve that by just... There we go. That improves the connectivity. I'm not kidding, by the way. If you put it on totally dry, like just off the table and under your wrist, it'll look pretty bad. Here's an ECG with poor connectivity, dry, and then here's an ECG with good connectivity. But to take that ECG, you will simply tap on Measure Now. You'll take your other finger over here. You'll put it up there on the left-hand side, and then just wait and sit. You can put your hand on your other hand, that's fine. You want to have it as stable as possible. And now you'll see the ECG come through there. The way this works, of course, is this is graphing your data right there. It's also saving it to the watch, but it's not going to do any sort of AFib detection or regular heart rate rhythm detection. And that's a core difference between what Polar's doing and virtually everyone else. So you can see at the end here, I got my heart rate average, heart rate variability, beat to beat interval. And then from there, this will sync to the Polar Flow app, and you can see it right here. And I can go ahead and pull that data off and send it as a PDF to a doctor. But again, the key thing Polar is not doing is any sort of AFib type detection here, which is something that Apple and Samsung and Garmin and Fitbit and basically everyone else have gone through the FDA as well as the EUCE testing, the entire medical device level of things to get unlocked. Polar hasn't done that. So if you're looking for that, it's not here. And that's something that Polar sounds like they're interested in doing, but that process takes a long time. You're talking like at least a year of studies with many, many hundreds of people in it. So it's not something that can just turn on overnight to have that, at least at the medical device level. Now, let's go entirely different direction and talk about sports and the sport modes and how that all works. So back on the home screen here, I would tap the lower left-hand button again, and I tap Start Training. From there, you'll see all my different sport modes. This is the most recent one that I've used, but I can swipe up and down this list through these modes that I've rearranged into kind of my favorite listing. Now, this is fine, but this screen hasn't changed in like at least a decade of Polar sport watches. And frankly, it's just a lot of swiping to go through all these modes. Most other watches have like 3 or 4 modes shown per screen. It just saves you a lot of time trying to find their sport mode in there. So I like to see Polar update the user interface just a little bit here. Nonetheless, no big deal. We're gonna go to road running just for fun. On the top there, you see the heart rate lock if I had it on my wrist, as well as the GPS lock, and also the connectivity of the phone, as well as the battery life. If I tap this upper left-hand button right there, I can get to some of the settings. And then going down, I've got power save. This will broadcast my heart rate out using Bluetooth Smart, training suggestion, favorites, race pace, interval timer, countdown timer, routes where I load a route up, and back to start. So we'll talk about routes a little bit later on, so just hang tight on that for just a second. But instead, I want to mention that you customize all the data fields and data pages in your sport modes from your smartphone. So using the Polar Flow app, you can add up to 8 different data pages, which is a fair number of data pages, although only 4 data fields per page. Most of the watches in the same size and category allow 6, if not 8 or even more data fields. So I like to see Polar increase that as well. But Polar has the majority of the fields that you'd want. Additionally, Polar can connect to sensors. You can see at the top there's the heart rate icon, but if I go down to the cycling one here, you'll see road cycling. It's starting to look for my power meter. So they can connect to Bluetooth smart power meters. You can also connect to test straps as well as cycling cadence and speed sensors and Bluetooth foot pods. They don't have quite as much connectivity beyond that, but again, they've got kind of the core things you need there. Now, once you've got all your stuff set, you can just tap this to start your particular workout, and you'll see the data screens that you've got set up. So you can see here, I've got these data screens right there, and I can scroll through all the different data fields. Instead, I'll show you what some of these look like on the run right now. Again, this first one at the top there with the distance, pace, and duration. And then I got my running power right there. Running power is done from the wrist, nothing else to know the accessories required for that. And you have elevation data fields and heart rate data fields. And of course, you can just tap to swipe through the data fields as you want while you're running along. At the end of the workout, you'll get an entire summary of that full workout with all these detailed pages here. Polar's done a really good job of leveraging the brilliance of that AMOLED display to show you tons and tons of stats right there, where you don't feel like you have to go to your phone to see the details of that particular run. They don't show any like map summary, which is probably the only one outlier, but otherwise a really good job of showing all those stats and zones, etc. Of course, if you did want to see all those stats on Polar Flow, which is their mobile app, you can see that. Here's a couple screenshots right there. You can also see that on their desktop website as well, and then further it'll sync off to Strava, Trending Peaks, whatever other platforms you want that you can connect to Polar Flow. Now, once all that's set and done, Polar does have some training load and recovery tools. If you swipe through the menus here, you'll go and find the cardio load status option. So if I tap into this, you can see basically my cardio load status over the last little while compared against my historical norms. So right now I'm in the productive range. I didn't do a whole lot last week. I kind of kept it a bit of a chill week after the previous very, very high intensity week. And this week I'll kind of ramp things back up again. You can see a little blurb there saying you've been training progressively, which should help improve your fitness level. Keep it up. Now, one of the things to keep in mind though is that Polar used to be kind of the king of training load and recovery type tools. And these days, they haven't really done anything in this realm in many years. And so none of this has changed, and ultimately, they've fallen way far behind their competitors. If I look at the screenshot right here, this is one of the most basic training load screens from both Garmin, Polar, and Suunto. In the case of Garmin, they're showing way more data about my training load and how it relates to my normal historic load. And the same with Suunto, albeit in a slightly different category there. If I were to swipe down from Suunto's menu, they would show even more details right there. And you may be saying, oh, but Polar has the same thing. Well, Polar's only shows your training time, not your training load. And if you're looking at endurance sports, it's about load, not really time that matters. And that's where I feel like Polar, given their slightly higher price point now, needs to kind of step it up a little bit. In any event, onto mapping and navigation, which of course is the star feature on this watch. Now, the way mapping works is that by default, your watch will come with basically a base data set of either Europe or North America, depending on where you buy the watch. If you buy it outside of that, then you get the detailed set for that particular region. But what you need to know is that there are essentially two different map sets that you can download from the Polar Flow website. There's basic and there's detailed. Basic saves a bunch of space, and this watch has 32 gigs of space on it. Versus detailed uses more space, but gives you additional detailed maps. It gives you stream and river names. It gives you smaller trails in the map. It gives you topographic lines, contour lines in the map, which is super important. So you're going to want to choose detailed. The map sizes aren't that big in the grand scheme of things. Here's just a quick list of some random places in the detail level that you can download. To download maps, you're going to go to the Polar Flow website, and then from there, you'll just simply download this giant file for each region that you want. It's a very straightforward thing. It's like one big old zip file, if you will, of all the maps, and you're just going to drag that onto your watch. As simple as that. There's no Wi-Fi in this. There's no downloading it via the cloud. It's way too big for Bluetooth and stuff like that. So you do need to have a computer, or you can actually use an Android phone with a charging cable. You can plug it in and use effectively the Files app to put it on there. So if you're in a pinch, you can do that. Anyways, once you have your maps on your device, then you can go ahead and see your maps, which sounds obvious, but there's some catches here. There is no basic Maps app on the device. You have to be in one of the sport modes, which isn't a big deal because I think most people, if they're going to use maps on a watch like this, they're going to be doing a sport. Otherwise, you're probably just going to use your phone. So you open up a sport app and you'll see your current location in that particular app on the map. Again, fairly straightforward. You can zoom in and out. You can also pan left and right using your finger. All that works great. Now, if you were to start that workout right then and there without loading a route, then you wouldn't see any of your historical breadcrumb trail. Meaning if I were to walk through the forest, it would just show me my dot in the middle of the forest, but not where I came from. Instead, in order to see where you came from, you have to load a route that shows where you're going, which is a bit convoluted. This is something that was solved on GPS watches like 15 years ago, and somehow Polar's regressed here. I don't really understand what's going on, but what I do know is Polar has confirmed that if you do not have a route loaded, you will not see a historical breadcrumb trail, at least for now. So that's a bit of a bummer. So we will load a route. In my case, I was doing a hike that I planned as 45 kilometers. That didn't work out. It went a lot longer than that, but I planned 45 kilometers. I created this route through the mountains of Majorca there, and it was going to be pretty awesome. I loaded it into the device, got it loaded up, got it started, and off I went. On my map, you can see right there that it shows me that blue route of where I'm going, and then this red section of this other picture shows you where I've been to date. So all that's relatively straightforward. And I was following the route just fine, more or less, but this trail was super overgrown. It was well past its prime.
So this is currently the trail, which is making for a very, very long day. You can see there's a little marker. I haven't seen one of those markers in a long, long time, but they're here. And this actually is pretty nice right now. What sucks is when I have to go up through that mess up there, which happens every 5 or 10 minutes. And right now I'm moving at best a kilometer an hour.
But that's fine. It made it for an adventure, except I'd have to go off the trail here and there to figure out where I was going around cliffs and things like that. Again, very, very overgrown. And when I went off route, I would lose my historical route as well. It would basically just like disappear entirely from the map, which is kind of crazy because if I was in the darkness, which I would be later on that night, that would have been a substantial problem. And I wanted to backtrack to something and could no longer see where I was going. Polar says it's something I'm looking at addressing down the road, but for now it is kind of what it is. The main problem I had, though, was that it started crashing. So about a little more than 2 hours into that hike, the watch entirely just crashed out of the middle of nowhere. Literally, I was just standing there. And so I reloaded the route again, and then a minute later, it crashed again. I tried this like a few times, and eventually was like, well, let me try not loading the route. And then it stayed on for about 2 hours before I got brazen. I was like, maybe I can load the route now. Maybe it'll work. No, it crashed a minute later. So then I said, fine, I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to leave it for the next 8 hours of hiking. And I did just that. I didn't use routing anymore for the rest of that hike. And even if it did crash, the navigation and mapping functionality on this is a fraction of what their competitors have at the same price point. And you can pick any competitor you want. They all have more navigation and routing functionality. So this is an area that Polar really needs to double down on to make this watch competitive at, again, that $599 price point. So before we talk about accuracy, let's briefly talk about the battery life. So as I mentioned earlier on, their day-to-day battery life claim is 8 days in basically gesture-based or 5 days in always-on mode. And just because I didn't touch on it earlier on, gesture-based means that the screen turns off when your wrist is down like this, and then as you raise your wrist up like this, the screen goes to full brightness, and then you can see it again. That's gesture-based. However, I have an always-on mode, which means that right now you can see it goes to a dim state. It's probably hard to see right there. There we go, a dim state. And as I turn my wrist up like this, it goes to full brightness. And that's the mode I prefer and what I use all my watches in. In that mode, it's 5 days. And both of those claims in my testing are true. Like they've held up pretty well using the default medium brightness mode. Now, when it comes to GPS times, there's kind of some different levels they put in here. The main one is 42 hours of GPS time, and not always on mode, but with dual frequency or multiband GPS, which is the higher level GPS enabled. And you should be able to get, again, that 42 hours. So then how did the battery handle in that long hike? Well, in that case, I had the always-on display enabled, as well as dual frequency GPS, so the higher setting that would show me get like 42 hours or so. And I had navigation to start for the first 2 or so hours before it crashed. The remainder of that time period, it would have been navigation disabled, and I would just use most of the normal data pages on there. Still, at the end of the hike, literally the second I went to go hit the stop button, it automatically stopped for me and basically ended the activity. So when it gets to 5% battery life, like you see on the screen right here, it automatically like saves and ends your activity, like end of the story. So that was astounding timing, but it left me a bit concerned. After all, we're talking just 12 hours, basically a quarter of its claimed battery life. So I shot that over to Polar and was like, what gives? And back and forth a little while, and basically what they said, there's actually a different claim for always-on mode, which is roughly 28 or so hours. And I said, well, we're still pretty darn short of that by more than half at this point. And they said, well, there's yet another different mode, which is that when it's always-on mode and it's bright and sunny out, they will increase the display brightness even when your wrist is down, and you're only at about 12 hours in that claim. There's some interesting things here. First off, one, that's a really low battery claim, which isn't super awesome. But two, what is super interesting is that claim of having the display brighter. And this is something I noticed on the hike, mostly at night, which isn't what Polar said it should be doing, but it did nonetheless. When I was at night in the woods in the middle of nowhere, I was like, wow, the Polar screen is still really bright right now. And what Polar's doing is actually pretty interesting. One of the criticisms of AMOLED displays like this is that when it goes down on your wrist like this, and you're no longer looking at it, you can't see it as well off angle, because again, it's in a dim state. Now, that's not an issue when you raise your wrist, because again, it instantly goes up to full brightness and life is good. But if you have it on a bike handlebar or something like that, or if you're just not used to that wrist flick, which is something most people get used to within a few weeks. After all, Apple Watch is like on Series 9 now, so 9 years of this, and people are totally used to this concept. But nonetheless, it's a hurdle to get over. So Polar's trying to solve that, and that's a super cool idea. But I need to be able to turn that off when I want the battery life. And right now you can't do that. It's either all or nothing. So again, Polar doing something that could be super cool for a segment of the population, but for everyone else, they probably just want the double, triple, quadruple battery life instead. Okay, so let's look at the accuracy, both the GPS and the heart rate accuracy, as well as briefly the elevation too. So I'm gonna pick just a few different workouts that are largely representative of my overall experience over the past month and a couple different kind of terrain scenarios. The first one is in forested zones here. So this is all in the forest. And overall, you can see compared to the Suunto Race as well as the Garmin Epix Pro, these were all very, very similar. A couple brief moments where the Suunto Race just meandered a bit for no particular reason. There was other moments where the Polar Vantage V3 meandered as well briefly, but on the whole, not too big a deal. Likewise, here's another activity, a hike. In this case, this was somewhat wooded, somewhat not wooded, open areas, cliffs, solids, mountainsides, all that kind of fun stuff. And these watches were basically identical across the board. There was no meaningful difference there at all. So instead, let's step things up quite a bit. This run was a run that I do primarily to test the GPS in city environments, but it started off pretty easy, just basically open kind of fields, if you will, and no problems there from any of the watches. This is the Suunto Race, the Polar Vantage V3, the Coros Pace 3, and the Garmin Forerunner 965. So with the exception of the Coros, all three of those basically compete against each other. So anyways, along those open areas, no problems at all, but under some of the bridges and overpasses, the Polar struggled a little bit more than the others did, so a little bit of some quirks there. And then we got to the city area, and this downtown city core is very challenging. It's 20 to 30 story tall buildings on both sides of the street. I purposely run down the very middle of some of the streets where I'm able to, and the other streets I actually change sides of the road so that no watch has an advantage or disadvantage for any longer period of time. In this particular case, out of the 4 watches, I think it's pretty clear that the orangey color there of the Vantage V3 is the least accurate of that bunch. I would say the most accurate on this particular one was probably actually the Coros Pace 3, and it's done this route a few times, and this is by far its best performance of it. There's been other times where it's kind of more middle of the road, similar to, in this case, the Suunto Race and the Garmin Forerunner 965. Meanwhile, changing things up again to my giant old hike here, overall, it was very, very similar. Now, keep in mind, I can only judge about 8 of those 12 hours because it lost the first 4 or so hours of data. But looking at the rest of it, it's very, very similar to the other ones. There's a handful of times where you see some very slight differences between those 3 upper end watches of the Garmin Forerunner 965, the Suunto Race, and the Polar Vantage V3. They were always within just a handful of meters of each other. The Pace 3 showed a couple wobbles here and there, but that's a different thing for a different review. If I look at the elevation accuracy, this is something I started at the water side and I finished at the sea at the water side, and I, of course, went into the mountains for 12 hours. And so what's notable is that the weather systems changed in that time period. It went from sunrise through sunset into darkness, and then from a pressure standpoint, that was changing as well. Overall, the Suunto and the Garmin did the most correct at ending at the sea level each time, or basically starting and ending at sea level, versus the Polar Vantage V3 ended about 20 meters high, which it seemed like just the last hour it started to go offset a little bit, but 20 meters in the grand scheme of things isn't that big of a deal. Speaking of that water, by the way, here's an open water swim. You can see it's basically identical to the swim buoy reference. So I have a swim buoy that I swim with that I can basically track my actual GPS track while the watch is on my wrist, because that's one of the most challenging things, because you lose signal every single time your arm goes under the water as part of the stroke. So in this case, very impressive results on the open water side, so good to see there. So what about heart rate accuracy? Well, that's been hit or miss, which is funny for Polar as a company. So look at this first set of intervals right here I did in the indoor bike trainer. You can see that overall it's pretty good, but it starts off a bit wobbly in those first few minutes. It's not quite like sticking the landing there initially. Not horrible, but so-so. Then we have another set. This is intervals from last night, and it's kind of even more wobbly. It's similar to the Suunto Race, not in a good way. The Suunto Race's optical heart rate sensor is not good, just to spoil that part of the review for you. It's been not good for a while, but in any case, the Polar Vantage V3 isn't great either here. Like this warm-up for the first 15 minutes is easy as pie stuff. Like this is the easiest thing you can do with an optical sensor is put it on your wrist and sit on a bike on an indoor trainer over there. Like that that should work perfectly. And it really struggled there more than I would have expected. And you can see here on this next workout that it's weird where it struggles and doesn't struggle. For the first, like 8 or so minutes, you can see it kind of wobbling all over the place again. But then for those harder intervals, it sticks the landing really well. It nails all those. It's perfect across the board for the rest of that, 45-minute or so workout. But then we got this run from this past Saturday where it was a dumpster fire along with a Suunto race. Both these watches really struggle with optical heart rate on a run that should have been pretty easy. It was a very steady state, relatively chill run. And then every 2 kilometers, I would do 2 minutes at tempo pace, not interval pace, not like hard running pace, just a nice sustained like 10K race pace. So nothing too crazy. And each time I did that, the Polar Vantage V3 like just fell off the boat, and it was really weird there. It's something I would not have expected. Yet for contrast on that, a week or so prior, I did this really hard interval workout on the treadmill, and it was beautiful. Like this is spot on perfect, like absolutely nailed there. And I couldn't figure out the pattern until just this afternoon when I started putting all these data sets together and realized that it's the most recent firmware on this, the one that's currently shipping. That's the problem. The firmware version I had previous to this was great for optical heart rate, and then whatever's happened now is gone bad. And generally speaking, when it comes to firmware breaking things in optical heart rate, it usually means that they've lowered the power to the sensor, meaning lower the brightness of those green lights on the back there to save power. Again, usually to try to get higher battery life claims. So that may be what they're doing, or maybe it's something else entirely different. Either way, things went from great to not so great, and hopefully they can refine greatness again, because obviously heart rate sensors are kind of Polar's thing. Okay, so the big question is this watch worth it? Is this watch ready? And that's a tough question. So at $599, $600, it is the exact same price as the Garmin Forerunner 965, and it's $150 more than the Suunto race that was released less than 24 hours or so prior to it, or after it, or basically like within the same day of this thing it came out, this was released. And now I think we can all agree, like feature-wise, even Polar would say, the Garmin has far more features. Like no one's competing against features with Garmin. Of course, in the case of Garmin, they don't have quite as nice of a case from a material standpoint. Looks-wise, it just depends on what you're looking for. I don't really care either way, to be honest. They seem kind of like whatever. I personally think the Suunto looks nicer from a look standpoint, but again, that's just my personal like fashion sense. And as my wife reminds me all the time, I don't have much fashion sense. So take that for what you want. But of course, materials are just like one part of this thing. In the grand scheme of things, there's all these features to talk about, and that's an entirely separate video. The question is this actually ready? And that's a bit tougher. I think that right now it's not quite ready. It's close. If I bucketize some of the issues here, if I look at things like the crashes, I'm actually not that worried about all the crashes I've had. The reason is that they have my debug information and my logging information. They're going to figure out exactly what's causing those crashes. That's actually one of the least problematic things to solve in software development. Then you get to the next thing, which is all that like routing funkiness of like going off course and not having the track and stuff like that. That too is actually relatively easy to solve. That's just them deciding to enable or not enable different things in the feature, and even they have said that that's something they're looking at doing. The thing that starts to concern me though is actually the heart rate side of it. The fact that we went from functional to not so functional is a bit of a concern, but maybe they can get back to functional again by just reverting whatever change that is. The bigger challenge I think Polar actually has beyond all those little catches is, can they outline a path forward? So one of the things that Polar did a few years ago when they released a watch that wasn't ready yet was they basically started publishing what they're going to be doing for the next few months, 3, 6 or so, 9 months out, saying here's the features we're going to add, so that consumers had trust that the missing features would eventually land up on their watch. And I think Polar really has to do that here. When they decided to price this watch at $600, the same price or more than these watches over here, they set themselves up for that particular like trapdoor to open up, and now they've got to go ahead and outline what their future is. And while some people may say that'll give away their plans to the competitors, let's be honest, their competitors already have all those features. Like, there's no surprise there what they're going to do next. Polar has to outline those features and outline how they're going to get from a watch that isn't quite worth $600 today to a watch that should be worth $600, at least from the hardware specs it has on it, with the right amount of features behind it. If they can do that, then this watch could be super cool down the road, and I think it could be that pivotal turning point for Polar as a company in shifting to a more successful trail. Anyways, if you found this video interesting and useful, go ahead and like that like button at the bottom there, or subscribe for plenty more sports technology goodness, including this review, hopefully tomorrow night, probably Wednesday, let's be honest, but very, very shortly here. With that, have a good one.